Welcome to another episode of Truth Wanted. I am your host, ObjectivelyDan, and today is a very, very special episode. The ACA has been around for over 20 years now. It's produced a lot of different shows, but this is, as far as I know, the very first time a theist will be guest hosting on one of those shows. Matt at Dillahunty is looking at me in the audience and says that's not true. I don't know what other things he's talking about, but first one that a guest host is taking calls from. There we go. Okay, yep, that's it. That's what well, he says maybe. Well, it doesn't matter. This is a special episode anyway because this is the first heathen guest host. We can say that. I think the ground is clear for that kind of project. So anyway, please, if you're at home, give a big round of applause to my host today, Ocean the Wizard. Welcome, Ocean.
Hi. I didn't realize you were going to be going with the wizard, but yeah.
Well,
that's my Twitter handle. It's something that it's a little bit of snark. But that it borrows from the wizard being a kind of the traveler sort of entity that is based around Odin. So like, Gandalf in The Hobbit is based on the image of Odin, as well as like many of the dwarves are based on the legend called the Volsung. So there's a lot of like hand in hand with old wizard legends and Norse mythos and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, already a bunch of deep stuff there that that we're just dropping right on the fly. I love it. It's great. So the reason why I got you on the show today, Ocean, is because I've seen you around. We've actually talked a little bit before. You're a somewhat frequenter of the ACA Discord. I've seen you on there talking to people and stuff, and I've always been impressed by your level of conversation. You've demonstrated like very well that you like know what you're talking about, and you've got all kinds of just facts and information about the heathenism in general that I just have no idea until really I saw you talking to people about it. And I wanted you to kind of come on here so you could just talk about that a little more, and so that you can just kind of talk about the journey of how you got to where you are. Because as I understand it, you, like me, were also once a Christian, right?
Yeah, I grew up as a Christian. I'm born and raised in the South. I'm still in the South. And started out as a Baptist. Like that's where my family kind of like was. So I went from Baptist, and then we moved up into deeper North Georgia, and the Baptist religion got way too conservative for my family at the time. So we wound up drifting into Episcopalianism, which is like a hard left as far as the journey goes, if anybody's familiar with Episcopalianism. I think Robin Williams is described as Catholic light, but like really light. Like, but eventually out of that, I then drifted into a form of Celtic polytheism, and then I've just been developing from there, and I've been polytheist for about 10 years. And now I'm the technical label for what I am, if you want to like try and bring it all out, is really long and confusing, but because it deals with a lot of terms that people generally aren't familiar with. But if I'm going to throw it at you, it's a druidic syncretic pagan, a syncretic heathen, where I venerate the Germanic pantheon specifically, but I also borrow from the Celtic and Roman and a few others as well. So
yeah, see,
it's been a long like philosophical journey.
Yeah, sounds like it. So like my journey of like kind of deconverting from my previous beliefs was a lot of research on kind of the big three, the Abrahamic traditions of faith, and discovering the different doctrines and such from that faith tradition. And I don't want to say that I didn't look into heathenism, but it wasn't really on my radar. I didn't really know a lot of people who were heathen.
A lot of people don't realize it can be taken seriously. It becomes discounted fairly quickly as like a dead religion that doesn't have any bearing or something like that.
Yeah, and this was something we talked about because my understanding of what most heathens were, at least in today's world, kind of used the heathen mythos, I should say, and not to say mythos as the metaphor,
I
right?
use
As
the
like
word myth. So
yeah. So
yeah.
like myth is like
in the Alan Watts sense. That
yeah.
it's
So
with an image of what reality is like. You can have like an atheistic myth of an automatic model.
right, for sure.
Alan Watts has gone into that a couple of times, which is it's neat. If you haven't heard Alan Watts, you should check him out. But yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
go
yeah.
ahead. That myth is fine.
Right. So yeah, because if you say myth for a Christian, sometimes they get offended
freak
and
out, yeah.
they freak out. But like, no, I mean myth in the cultural sense, in the in the living sense. So what your understanding of the heathen tradition is that of there are external beings, right? And my assumption was that was the minority view, but you're saying that for most heathens today, that is actually the position that they take, right?
So there's no study on it, right?
Okay.
So and I think a lot of anybody who says most is going to be coming at it from like what their experience is, and people tend to hang out with like-minded people. It's true in the pagan community as well. And I've been building community online. I've been building a community here in the South in real life as well, where people can actually physically meet. And what I've found, and it could be just that, how we conduct ourselves attracts a certain brand of person, but that belief in the gods as actual gods is either the most common or becoming more common. I think that the largest body of pagans, I think, still is Wiccans. But heathenry has either overtaken that or is catching up with it. I'm not quite sure. There's definitely a rise in heathenry recently, with a temple being built in Iceland and with more people coming to the practice in America. But without any like actual studies or census on the issue, we can't really say for sure. It's a bit of a mystery. So it's a lot of like shooting from the hip when anybody's trying to say most pagans believe X. But I've certainly been promoting a traditional polytheistic structure, and so have others that have been practicing with me and that have been joining communities that I'm a part of or have started or helped start or anything like that. So.
Interesting. That is a lot. So it seems like almost the same problem that we have sometimes in the atheist community, where we try to measure actually how many there are. Depending on the research methods, it can get kind of tricky. Most people just say, well, it's just lack of belief of God. But like, there's a lot of people who say that they're atheists but don't identify with that statement, and kind of vice versa as well.
Yeah, you get people that are like, I'm agnostic.
Yeah.
Not atheist. Or you get people that are like, hi, I'm, which I, like Steve McRae, for example, I don't know if you've bumped into him. He's pretty adamant that he is an agnostic and not an atheist, and he has very specific reasons why he says that. And then you have other people that are saying, I'm not an atheist, I'm a non-cognitivist, or I'm, or anybody that doesn't have like philosophical rejection is definitely not an atheist. Anybody who's an agnostic is an atheist. So there's a lot of lack of clarity as far as what, if you're going to take a census, what are you defining as atheist? And then you get also people that are atheists that still follow kind of a new agey structure like spirit science or something like that, where they don't believe in gods per se, but they do believe in some things that are still very religious. So do you consider them atheist? Is another big question.
Right. It can get kind of tricky on the details, because what we might consider in one community what atheist means might not be for some other people. And that's the kind of the tricky thing with definitions. But before we get into like specific beliefs, because I am interested in that, I'm really more curious as like your journey as to how you got from being this, this Christian kid growing up in the South to where you are now. You mentioned
rural South, even.
Yeah. Yeah. So like,
because I didn't convert until let's see, I was a hard Christian until about 20 to 21, and I it was through like a number of experiences that I felt that there was like a kind of an overwhelming presence it didn't seem to cohere with my Christian experience. It seemed like there was something else. So that's what started getting me to question of like, well, what is this kind of idea of religious experience? What are we really going into when we're talking about that? Another element was I started drifting away from Christianity, but not spirituality. And I took a walk one day, because Christianity was just like one thing that kept me in Christianity was hell, and I think that's true for a lot of people. Where there's like this threatening punishment of hell, and growing up in the South as a Baptist, that gets drilled into you when you're pretty young. So it stopped making sense as to why a loving God would structure a universe in such a way that you need to like know about a relatively, like when you think about it, obscure historical fact and believe it in order to be saved from the burning pits of hell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I took a long walk on that and trying to convince myself, like, all right, let's bring out all the best guns. Let's talk to myself and kind of try to figure out, okay, how does this work? Let's explain it in a way that does. And I couldn't actually make it work. So at that point, it was just like, well, I think that spirituality has value, but Christianity, it doesn't seem to reflect reality, and it doesn't seem to reflect the description of an all-loving God. So there's parts of the Bible that are problematic for that, and there's a ton of issues when it comes down to like how Christians practice and believe that just are bad logistics.
Yeah.
So how can a perfect God be this bad at logistics was one problem that I had.
Interesting.
I left Christianity at that point, and I became kind of like a quasi-agnostic for a period of time before bumping into paganism.
So before I go on, just letting people know, you're free to call in. We will be taking some questions from people who want to call in and talk to either me or Ocean. Our call lines are open right now, and the number should be on screen. So go ahead and call if you can. So I want to know specifically because, like me, you grew up in the South. You grew up kind of in a cultural bubble of Christianity, even for when it doesn't make sense. To me, the natural inclination is to start doubting everything, is to start doubting all kinds of religious claims. So I'm wondering, like, did you know someone that was heathen? Was it like an internet, or was it, that's a very specific path, it seems.
It is. And I think that to romantically put it, I think the mountains converted me, but I was in a place that has a very, very beautiful nature, that I was surrounded by just like the majesty of nature. And I had a position at that point, as after leaving Christianity, that that there was a kind of like soul to life or a soul to nature kind of thing. That was something that was like an intuition in going through hikes and all this other stuff, spending a lot of time in nature. And I wanted to explore spirituality from that standpoint. And from there, I started finding some things kind of related to old ideas of Celtic belief. I was in college at the time, minoring in religion, majoring in history, and came across some footnotes in history books about the Druids, and thought, well, that's interesting. Let's see a little bit more about it. And through exploring into that and taking the exploration of it very seriously, wound up with some experiences that I found hard to deny, and embraced the exploration aspect of it and kept going down that path. Eventually coming to polytheism and heathenry as a result of just that continued exploration.
And yeah, I remember last time we talked as well, we talked about kind of these personal experiences that you had that seemed really, just like impactful for you. That kind of, would you say that? Yeah. So would you say that they helped confirm your beliefs to be true in that sense?
No, I think they led me to different ones. Like I said, the first time that I had it, I was a Christian. So, it's easy to have that kind of experience as a Christian and explain it through some kind of Christian thing. But for me, it was an experience that was very distinct. So from that, I was like, this is something else. and I was reading the God Delusion at the time, actually. So I was like hovering in between Christianity and maybe leaving Christianity, and at least like giving atheism like its fair shake. What I thought was its fair shake. I don't think that book is necessarily a fair shake, but continuing on though, that I was entertaining other ideas, but then I bumped into this experience while I was in Ireland at the time, and came away with it. It was just like, this is new. I don't really know what to do with that. So, and then it sat for another year and a half before I actually decided. It's like, well, no, what I am is pagan at this point. Is my beliefs had drifted kind of naturally into this direction, and to the point where I kind of discovered, well, the label's different now. It's I'm a pagan. I'm a polytheist.
So it sounds like you were already kind of leaning towards the beliefs that you were kind of researching and studying, and then those experiences kind of helped you confirm some of what you were reading.
No, I think it was the opposite. I didn't start getting into Druidry or reading about it until after my experience that I had as a Christian.
Okay.
And that's the part that was kind of weird.
Your Ireland experience.
Right.
Is that you were still a Christian then?
Yes.
Okay.
And I was on a trip with other Christians, and they relayed having a similar experience. So there was a shared personal gnosis, if you will. That's a term that we use between pagans, is unverified personal gnosis, shared personal gnosis, and verified personal gnosis, which is different definitions on like what level of spiritual experience you're discussing. But that experience was one that was shared between me and other Christians, and they kind of took it as a confirmation of their Christianity. Some of them,
yeah.
But for me, it was like, this is distinct. It doesn't seem like the same thing that I experienced during prayer or in church or these other things. So
that's interesting. You were with other Christians who seem to also be experiencing something supernatural, maybe divine,
right.
Something not normal to their daily lives. But you both came away with like different interpretations of that. They
right.
came as like interpretation of the Christian God.
They came as that there was something like we didn't discuss it a whole lot.
Okay.
But there was what happened was people, like, we all took off our shoes, for example, to get closer to the land that we were walking through. It was a place in Ireland that is considered a thin place, where is considered by the Druids to be a thin place, where the line between the spiritual world and the physical world is very thin. And and this is, again, just like one spiritual experience, but it was something that we all kind of felt about the place, and it could be that, like, there's a million ways to explain it, I'm sure. That you have like a group that's experiencing something together, and we all kind of convince one another, or but for me at that point, it was like, this is a spiritual experience. Other people seem to believe that it's also a spiritual experience, but at the risk of repeating myself, for me it was distinct from the Christian experience. And
at least what the Christians have
inspired
described.
me to explore a little bit more.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting, because I myself have had experiences when I was a Christian that I also once interpreted as, a Christian God. And I think we talked about this before.
But we were on a street epistemology stream together.
Right.
That was fun.
And and I had the same conclusions, as far as I don't think that my experiences are actually matching up with what Christianity says should be happening, first of all, and also
right.
just, there could be, and what I later determined to be personally, to be a naturalist explanation for what was going on. I didn't see really a mechanism for why I should believe that it was supernatural in the first place. But
sure.
But and that's kind of where it's hard for me to kind of relate to where you're at right now, because does someone need to have the conceptual framework that you were already working with in order to come to the conclusions that you did about your experiences?
I don't know. In the time that I've been among other pagans. That that there's usually a similar sort of story to what I'm describing that brings people into this faith, and some of them come from an area of Christianity. Some of them come from leaving Christianity and going into atheism, and then leaving atheism. I don't think that I could describe my interim period as being an atheist. I think that I was somebody who just like withheld judgment for a period of time. I got really into Taoism at that point, but that experience that I described was still just kind of like sitting there, and I decided to just kind of explore it and see what it matched up with, and I found some interesting stuff in my study of history going beyond that.
Cool. Well,
so like the answer is I don't know what. Like, I don't think that there is a described set of beliefs that you have to have before becoming polytheist, but...
Gotcha. Well, let's go ahead.
Being open to it, I'm sure, helps. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. No, I'm sorry to interrupt you. So we have a couple callers here, and we're going to see what they want to talk to you about. The first one we have here is Ben from Georgetown, Texas. Ben, can you hear us? What's up?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Cool.
Hey, great show, Dan.
Thank you.
Good to speak to you. I understand you had some interesting experiences, and it led you to believe in the North Pantheon and look into that a little deeper. And I was wondering if you can detail some other experiences that you had that you can definitely say, you know what, it's the North Pantheon that makes all the sense in the world versus every other religion that's possibly out there. Like, how'd you come to that conclusion specifically?
Sure. So,
share any of those experiences?
The polytheist position is not necessarily what you're kind of framing it as. I think that the Christian God probably exists. I think that other pantheons' gods probably exist. And in my personal practice, I'm an adherent to the Northern Pantheon, but at the same time, I'm also an adherent to the Roman and the Celtic. So I don't think that I've been in polytheism for a while, and it's the general attitude that I've come across among other polytheists is that we don't, there's not like a rejection of other pantheons when we start to follow a specific tradition. We're following a tradition of the gods that we feel that we've attained a kind of relationship with, and that's more the path. Like, there's a good friend of mine that follows the Egyptian pantheon, another good friend of mine that follows a collection of pantheons where he's founded more in the Greek set. But we don't have, there's very little disagreement among us, that our beliefs confirm one another.
Well, how is there no disagreement between you if you have different pantheons? Seems like
we see the gods as all existing. What does that polytheism mean? Ultimately, as a philosophical position, becomes very additive. It doesn't become like it's more. I think that it winds up resulting in a more tolerant position than something that's more exclusionary, such as Christianity or Islam, where you wind up trying to like push away all of these ideas. Now, it's interesting that one could say something about kind of the behavior of Hinduism. But that's something that I don't necessarily know a whole lot about, but I've heard that there's a little bit of controversy there as far as how Hindus treat other faiths. But
so let me just ask you something. If it sounds like it's kind of additive and it kind of anybody can join in on this pantheon, like, what is the criteria? What is stopping you? What is stopping me from finding a book from an ancient mystical source and like adding that to my pantheon? I mean, is there a process to
even the Book of Eric?
Yeah, I'm just curious because like let's say we discovered an ancient religion tomorrow from a civilization that we hadn't found anything from yet, and there's a whole pantheon of gods that they believed in. With that, I mean, could you
that
add
happens
that
often,
to your
actually.
pantheon?
Or that not necessarily often, but it's happened a few times. Like, I think that we've wound up discovering the Hittite pantheon. But as far as my personal practice, I don't necessarily venerate every single deity that I can possibly come across. There's deities that I foster a relationship with, and that's my personal practice. And
Okay,
there's
but
other
then
pagans that
that's
have their personal practice, and they foster relationships with those deities, and that's not a
One
huge
more.
issue between us.
I got one more question.
All right, we'll let you get
Go
one
for it.
more question in, Ben, and then I'm going to switch it off to somebody else.
Thank you. So what different legal structures or different laws would you like to see in place where you are based on your pantheon or multi-God beliefs that aren't instituted now?
Like-
New legislation.
I
What would you
don't
wanna
believe in legislating from the perspective of religious authority. As far like how we run our society, I believe in having a pluralistic attitude from a society of saying, all right, well, if you want to practice religion in public, fine, you can do that. We're not going to legislate from the bench on the basis of religious claims. It doesn't necessarily make sense to me. I think that it's like there's a conversation to be had about religion and society and how they kind of intermingle as far as culture is concerned. Christianity kind of messed things up a little bit when they created a religion that was to be distinct from culture, something that could be carried around and impressed on other cultures and become a cultural change piece. That's very like it's based on these commands, and polytheism doesn't have that kind of attitude necessarily. It's more about personal relationship with deity, and you can discuss it as far as like how it results with being a social relationship with deity, but that's a conversation that's something that's you can more reference what happened in Rome with that, where you had a pluralistic attitude in Rome, where they were adding deities to the pantheon as they discovered new deities. But as far as like what legislation I would want to see, that doesn't none other than religious freedoms.
All right. Well, thanks for your call, Ben. Appreciate that. We're going to go on to our next call. This is from Pi in Lexington, Kentucky. Pi, can you hear us? What's up?
Hey, Big D! What's up, Dan? It's good to see hear from you again. Ocean, it's really cool to see you. I think you're a great guest.
Thanks, man. Yeah, dude, we're going to have to catch up sometime. I don't know if I need to go where you are, you need to come here, but it's got to happen, so.
We can definitely make it work. My question's for Ocean. I heard
What's
that
up?
you was, or I guess Ocean, it sounded like you were on a journey, and I think you had mentioned that a couple of times, that you're, I guess, may not necessarily be at the destination that you plan to be at, say 10, 20 years from now, but I guess I'm really just wondering how far in your journey do you think you are with regard to establishing like a really confident position on where you are with your spiritual / God belief? And then I guess what other questions are you looking to be answered before you continue going on from where you're at?
It's a good question. I like that. So I can't say exactly what my position is going to be 10 years from now. I don't know. It's possible that I could change radically from the position that I'm at now. I like polytheism. I'm convinced by it. There's a part of me that's actually looking for what arguments there are against polytheism. I haven't really found anything satisfactory, but I am looking, just because I think that the part of practicing faith is to be challenging yourself and questioning yourself as much as possible. As far as where I'm at on the journey, it depends on. I don't know where I'm going to be winding up, so I don't know exactly where I am as far as that goes. But where I'm at now is a position that I appreciate, and I've fallen into a position of teaching others that are part of this faith as well. That I've read a lot about this. I'm fairly informed on it. I've been establishing communities and helping them grow and helping people get access to sources that they're looking for, because a lot of heathens generally are really hungry to find historical sources, something that's vetted and historical, rather than what you usually find when you're looking for pagan texts, where you get into this like wooey, strange shit. That
well, let me
it
stop
gets
you right
really
there.
messy.
Aren't there people that might say that your beliefs right now are
Oh, I'm sure.
wooey, strange shit?
I have definitely gotten that before, that my beliefs are wooey, strange shit. But the answer that I have to that is that my position, I believe, and I believe I can defend it, is coming from a rational position, and a philosophically rational position. So, and that's a huge discussion. I'd reference the Non Sequitur show with me and Eric Murphy having a conversation about that. If you're interested in exploring that conversation, it's whether or not I'm in a position that's well grounded from an epistemological standpoint or from a rational argument standpoint. And it's an interesting conversation. But yeah.
Pi, do you have something you wanted to add real quick?
Yeah, Dan, could I get your impression? Because I think hearing how you would answer the question would be really enlightening as well for both us that are listening to you and the guests as well.
So your question was, where do I see my beliefs 10 years from now?
No, more or less like, where do you see yourself with regard to the confidence of your current position that you have with regard to an existence of a God or not? And then what questions are you waiting to be answered before you are willing to, I guess, change your position or modify it?
Great question.
Okay. The second part of your question I didn't answer. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
And I can follow up.
I'm assuming you're talking about the Christian God, like Yahweh.
Any God.
Okay. I don't have any beliefs for any gods right now. The criteria for, and I would say, as far as like whether or not a God exists, I'm like 99% sure that there are no gods, or not. I wouldn't say that. I would say I'm 99% sure that my belief that my confidence in the gods, that there are no gods, is 99%. I'll just leave it at that. Whatever philosophical problems that might entail, because there comes a problem with defining what gods are, right? So if we're talking about deistic conceptions of gods where I don't necessarily have a criteria to demonstrate their validity, then I have no way of knowing whether they exist or not. So at that point, who's to say? But if we're talking about most mainstream conceptions of, Yahweh or the God of Abraham or, any of those kind of monotheistic traditions, they have certain qualities that I think we would be able to
are indicative of the people that made them without information that was privy to them at the time.
Yeah, they have qualities that we can at least examine. And so, like, if I was to change my confidence on that, I would want to see which qualities we can examine, and what evidence that we might have for those qualities, being of most parsimoniously being explained by those gods, rather than, say, a naturalist explanation.
What I'm generally looking for is coherentism. If you're going to have a God belief and you're going to be basing it on experience, it's generally fine with me. Is I think that if you're going to be dismissing experience, you need to have a good reason for it. With respect to the Christian God, however, as far as like how the Christian God is described, there's some attributes that it has, like omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and these things, when you start to examine like what they mean and what they entail, come up with a description that is just absurd. And then when you look at the defenses of them, when omnipotence is challenged and what does omnipotence mean, you get into more just philosophical problems about how it's described and what it entails. And there's a really good argument that I like for as far as dealing with Christianity, it's divine hiddenness, that if there's a God that is omnipotent and omnibenevolent and omniscient, and he desires to have a relationship with you, then something that is omnipotent and omniscient would know how to have a relationship with you, and it doesn't make sense for something that is omnipotent to desire something and not have it. So if that relationship is wanted by the God, then you should have that relationship with the God immediately. And if he desires that relationship with all of humanity, then why isn't all of humanity having this relationship with God? So
Yeah.
that sort of starts to fall
summarize
apart
that
unless you're a
first?
Calvinist and then you believe in the elect and you bite down hard on that and have a lot of fun and everybody else is a fucking reprobate, right?
Dan, would it be cool if I summarized what I heard real quick, just before I head out?
I couldn't hear you there, Pine.
Sure.
Can you say that again?
Oh, would it be cool if I summarized what I just heard before I head out?
Yeah, I say go ahead.
Okay, cool. It sounded like, Dan, you were saying that you more or less don't know because you don't have a criteria for what a God is, but you're looking for evidence that would convince you that it was true. And then it sounds like from Ocean, it's that he found a position that makes sense to him, that gives him a lot of comfort, that makes sense in his worldview, and he's looking for evidence to prove that he's wrong. And so between the two of you, I think there's a really interesting contrast in the sense of one person's looking for evidence to believe something, and the other person's looking for evidence to stop believing. And I wonder which between the two of you is the more rational position. But that's my
It's an
two
interesting
cents.
conversation.
Thank
I
you
think
for
that there's
I
a
really appreciate it.
sure, absolutely,
Bye.
man.
Appreciate it.
I think that there's a subtle mischaracterization. I liked what he said, but at the same time, I think there's a subtle mischaracterization that there is a the reason to believe is something that I've dealt with as far as trusting experience and that exploration and deciding to wing it and experiment with this with respect to looking for reasons to not believe. I think that that's more accurate, what he was talking about. But with looking for evidence as far as why to believe, I think that the polytheists have a clear definition of God. It's clearer than
I'll be honest, I
what
don't
a
know
lot
if
of,
I
like,
have a clear
theists and such.
definition, honestly. I'd love to hear what your definition is.
Stephen Dillon puts forward 3 attributes. So there's the disembodied mind as a attribute, great power as an attribute, and I'd have to grab the book to get the 3rd attribute. Just give me a second. I don't usually bring out this argument. Disembodied
not really
mind,
an
great
argument,
power,
is it
and
just-
highly involved mind. Sorry. Yeah, it's a
just
a
a
definition.
definition.
So it's
Yeah.
tautologist. So disembodied mind, great power, and highly evolved mind.
Okay.
So it's going to be, you're going to be dealing with something that is non-physical. And yeah, again, I would be repeating myself. Sorry.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to understand is how you choose what's true and what's not true. Because it seems like if I presented you a book of some pantheon of gods and you would know if I made it up or if it came from 1,000 years ago or whatever, how do you know that any of what I'm saying is real? How do you determine from what's true from what's not true? Or is that even a coherent concept? I mean, within your belief system, because I don't know. It
we get into the coherentism conversation. If you're going
Yeah.
to be talking about some like physical claims, then we have you have the foundational conversation around physicality, and you kind of move from there. And this is getting into the conversation that I think that I told you that I was annoyed with before this before we started this.
Maybe this can simplify it. How do you validate a non-physical thing as existing?
Logical consistency and coherence of experience.
Is it possible that something can be logically consistent and also not be true?
Sure.
Okay, so how do we know that it's true then if it's not a reliable method?
What do you mean by reliable? Wait, what are you?
Well, because what I'm trying to get at is I know, I mean, there are some theologies that could, in some construct, be coherent. I would probably not agree with it, but I mean, if you worded things enough, you could make it coherent, but that wouldn't necessarily make any of it true. I mean,
Sure.
it could, look, I mean, the universe could be created by unicorns. You know, I don't see why that couldn't be coherent. I mean, it's just, it doesn't necessarily logically.
This gets into some other stuff that we were discussing, I think prior to this, as far as like what standards that I have as far as God believes, that there needs to be an experiential aspect of it. There needs to be shared experiential aspect of it.
Aren't
And
experiences
there also needs to be historical verification.
But we also talked about how your Christian friends interpreted their experiences for the Christian God, right? So it seems to me that experience is also kind of an unreliable method to determining whether something is true.
It's not entirely reliable, sure, but it's the experience of the spiritual aspect that all of us agreed had happened. I found a difference in it; they did not, and that's interesting and fine. It's an unverified personal gnosis.
You yourself said that the Christian God is incoherent. I mean, in some sense,
as described.
Yeah, and so
and I think that Christians, when they pray to their deity, and there's a reciprocation, I think that there's a validity there. They're probably worshiping something.
What do you mean by a validity?
God that's
like because you're saying that the Christian God is invalid as a concept. So I don't know how you can say that that's valid if it's not working out, right? I mean, like, it's confusing to me because at one point you're saying the Christian God shouldn't exist or doesn't exist, at least by the description of Christians, but you're also saying that you're including the Christian God in your pantheon. So I don't know.
I don't include the Christian God in my pantheon.
Okay, sorry. Excuse me. But you say that there are people who do, and I don't know. It just seems unreliable to me. It seems that you're taking experiences that you're having and just kind of playing with what human traditions have come up with and fitting those traditions into your experiences.
Sure. I think that I'm realizing kind of what has happened here. I thought our discussion before this was going to be a little bit more productive. Instead, we're looking.
I'm sorry if you think that this is productive.
No, it's fine. Like I said, if this topic comes up, we're going to be dealing with it. No, hold on. We're gonna go through it. So, I'm fine with saying that polytheistic beliefs and that religious beliefs in general need to be provisional, and that we're examining them from a coherent structure. And that if you're going to be looking at things from an empirical structure and dealing with empiricism in order to have certain beliefs, then fine, you can do that. The problem is that if you're going to be basing everything entirely on an empirical structure, you're going to be running into problems when you start dealing with discussions of anything that's outside of the physical realm, such as things like numbers. I believe, for example, that math is discovered rather than invented by humanity. When you're going on pure empiricism and trying to build a dependable set of beliefs off of that, great. And when you're dealing with spirituality, you're dealing with something that doesn't necessarily have that ability, and that's part of the human condition, and that's fine. That doesn't mean that spirituality isn't true. It doesn't mean that we can't explore it. And I think that trying to say so is a little ridiculous.
Yes, so let me clarify real quick. Ocean and I did have a conversation before that we were trying to make this as productive as possible, and I want to hold myself to that as well by mentioning that I'm really glad that you're here, and I'm really enjoying this a lot. And this clarification is coming from my own point of view as to how to figure out what you're doing, because it really is just a confusion on my part and not necessarily something like I'm trying. I don't want you to get the impression that I tricked you or anything into coming here, because from what I see
not necessarily. I mean, it's not like. And it's not that I'm uncomfortable with the conversation. It's that we were talking about exclusive practice and
yes, and I want to get into that.
In community with atheism, I'm usually termed as an outsider, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
But the epistemology conversation is great. It's just that from my perspective, it is something that's been relatively played out, and that's why I referenced the non sequitur show conversation between me and Eric Murphy, because I think that's a really good example of the epistemology conversation in which Eric is putting up his best and I'm putting up my best. And that's, if you want to see that conversation with me, that's a really good example of it. As far as like the questioning that I see this is kind of going down with empiricism versus philosophical approach of deity and spirituality. It's like a rehash. It's a repeat of the same conversation.
Okay. Well, here's what I want to emphasize here. This was something that I wanted to talk about anyway at the beginning of the show, and I think we were kind of getting into discussion there a little bit, so I kind of almost forgot, but here I am talking about it now. So I wanted to
we can continue. I'm not saying that there's a
well. This is
I
want to talk about this next point anyway because I wanted to highlight kind of the parallels between what your community, I guess what you would describe as the heathen or pagan community, is going on today with the atheist community, in that we are both, and I'm going to use people groups with religious identities who aren't necessarily validated by the power structure currently in our country. There are tons and tons of people who, first of all, say that neither of us exist at one point, but also who just simply don't understand where we're coming from and don't really want to. You know, they're not really interested in the kind of cultures that we develop here. And I know that atheists don't have culture by default, but I am talking from the Atheist Community of Austin. And there are communities of people willing to get together and kind of have these conversations, and that's really interesting to me. So I wanted you to kind of talk about a little bit more on what it's like to be a pagan now in 2018, where there's people who kind of criticize your position, kind of talk about, you know.
Yeah. And again, I'm a pagan in the South, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But and I'm also a pagan in a city in the South. So there's a little bit of differences as far as how things are. I grew up in the country and I lived in the country as a pagan for some time. So, you know, you get into some situations socially in the South, especially where if you're not Christian, you ain't in. And I wind up identifying a little bit with atheists as far as like what their predicament is in society in this, specifically these places. Mm-hmm. Because we have a lot of similar beliefs. We have a lot of similar social beliefs. We both think that people that in marriage equality, for example, mm-hmm. A lot of like social liberties. We're on the same page. And religious expression liberties is I think there's a little bit of a divide, but for the most part, we're on the same page. And the thing that I find that I think this conversation has a little bit of is that there is a similarity between Christianity and atheism that is a practice of exclusivity, that there needs to be a propagation of your idea and in the public sphere. And from one perspective on the atheist position, it is a pushback. It's saying that I deserve to have the ability to have my own beliefs and be able to express them publicly. Thank you very, very much. And the pagan has that similar aspect as well. But the pagan also gets caught between the Christian saying all public practice of religion should be Christian, and the atheist saying all practice of religion needs to be out of the public square completely. And the pagan is sitting there in the middle of that going, well, this person wants me out and this person wants me out. All right, we're kind of interestingly stuck here. And it's when Christianity came about, this was a new idea. And I before the show, I brought up, I brought a couple of legends with me that discussed atheism and conversation about atheism in pagan backgrounds. And there is a wonderful quote that I'll pull out again, that is said by a warrior in a saga, that a Norse saga, saying, "I never gave sacrifice to Odin, and yet I have lived long." And that is a declaration from somebody who is an atheist in a Norse saga. And this is a character that fights side by side with pagans. And it's not seen as much of an issue. It's seen as something that's like, well, that's this person's practice. We fight together. We're in the shield wall together. And I think that there is opportunity for atheists, pagans, and other polytheists to fight side by side on a lot of these issues that we hold in common. But yes, as long as there's exclusivity practices of, I will not work with you because of your belief system, that's not going to get anywhere. We're not going to make any advancement. We're not going to be productive.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I am definitely of the camp that wants to allow as much religious expression as decently possible. I mean, obviously, there's a point where, my religious belief says I have to kill you. That's not going to fly
Correct.
in, modern society. But for the most part, like what you're doing as a heathen, I don't see any real problems of why you can't keep doing what you're doing. At least I haven't encountered any problems yet. So
And
that's interesting.
That's actually a discussion that I'm having with another atheist YouTuber named Cyrus the Skeptic. He and I are doing a podcast together, and before that, we had he and I met up at Waffle House, and we had a discussion about religious harm, what it means, what kind of propagates it, and how to approach it, and like if you're going to be practicing religion, how do you prevent it? And there was a discussion between myself and some other pagans about, and as well as Cyrus, what about heathenry is doing these same things as far as ousting other people, creating others, and so on. And we weren't able to really come up with much of an example. Sometimes you get groupthink, and sometimes you get exclusivity, but it's something that, from our perspective, that attitude is to be corrected. You're not supposed to. Your exclusivity practice is something that's imported from Christianity, and I think that that's something that, as well as picked up with atheists, that in their atheism, especially atheists that are ex-Christians, there's latent things in Christianity that are imported, and among those things is the exclusivity practice of I must propagate this idea, and I must people that disagree with this idea are to be excluded. So there's and it contributes to more divisiveness and so on.
Yeah,
and that's something that from pagan positions we try to have that discussion of stopping that, because latent Christianity is something that we're not Christians anymore. Why are we bringing that in?
Yeah,
it doesn't need to be there anymore. That was part of the harm.
Kind of
that
these
we
old
were escaping
practices that are so ingrained in us that they still affect us even in religious transitions. That's interesting. Yeah, for sure. So we have another caller here. This is from Timothy in Seattle, Washington. Timothy, can you hear us? What's up?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Okay. My question was, how do you view other religions? And this was directed more towards Ocean. And just kind of the reason I wanted to ask this question was because I was talking with a friend about violent interpretations of different religions and how we should approach them. Do we try and educate? Is that how we deal with these different interpretations of different religions and stuff? And so you kind of have different answers from an atheistic viewpoint. I was kind of wondering how you kind of approach these same questions from a heathenistic viewpoint. And so that was kind of my question.
Yeah. So when dealing with other religions, especially as a pagan, and heathen specifically for me, it's very difficult to educate and have a combined fellowship with somebody that believes you ought to burn for eternity, and even believes they ought to burn for eternity if they aren't saved by the grace of God. And that it becomes a very difficult conversation, because and to the point where it becomes an issue in friendships as well, where once you kind of realize that fact about any friend of yours or acquaintance that is a Christian, there is that, depending on the Christian, a lot of Episcopalians aren't like this, some Presbyterians aren't like this, you have annihilationists and so on. Christianity is incredibly varied. But that having that conversation and friendship with somebody who believes you ought to burn in hell, it creates an awkwardness. And I think that as far as people banding together for certain things like that, it creates an issue that doesn't really quite show up with pagans and atheists, because atheists don't believe that you should burn in hell generally. Maybe some of them do, but
Yeah, some of them do, maybe, but
yeah, but generally that's not the case. So there's a potential for education and sharing a fellowship between that line of communication. But when you get into monotheistic religions that have exclusive practices and a reward punishment eschatology, being like this end of the world stuff from which all the detractors are thrown into the molten lava or lake of fire or whatever it happens to be, that conversation, there's a barrier there that's very difficult to break. And that barrier can only be broken with conversation. But it's a difficult one. It's one that's it's very challenging in order to approach.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Sounds like it's pretty similar to what some people in the atheist community find as far as having conversations with people who are on literally the exact opposite spectrum of where we are. It's hard to kind of educate people or explain your thought process behind things if people aren't taking you seriously from the get-go. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that you find a community that seems to accept you and respect you a lot. I mean, I've heard a lot of good things from you from other heathens on Twitter, talking about how cool you are and stuff. And so I say good on you, man. I'm glad that you're engaging with the ACA community still. And I hope you feel like you still have a place at the table. Hopefully we'll see you around on Discord and stuff as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I continue to hang around. I like the conversation. There's a reason why I've been involved in it for this long. It's something that's, the puzzle is interesting to me. And I find spirituality to be a really interesting puzzle. And discussing it is a really interesting puzzle. And discussing it honestly gets more interesting once there's concessions of its legitimacy. And once you get away from that exclusivity conversation, we can just explore with each other and learn from each other, learn from our experiences, and try and figure out what's shared there.
Can I ask?
Because I think that spirituality is it's a really important part of being human. And that I find that when people leave Christianity, a lot of times they throw everything out, and there's several reasons why Christianity is propagated for so long, but the one reason why people might stick with it has to do with that spiritual component. You get independently practicing Christians that are there because of the spiritual component. Independently practicing pagans perpetuate because of the spiritual component. Where we exist without groups. I existed without a group for about 9 years. And eventually found a group within the past year and a half. So,
yeah. Can I ask you why it is that you continue to engage with other atheists about your beliefs, and why you think the conversation is even worth having?
I think that I want more understanding for polytheism specifically. And I think that continuing the conversation honestly and with charity does nothing but elevate the conversation, and people then go when they meet a pagan next time that isn't me, they come from, I've already had a positive experience with a polytheist. So with somebody who honestly engaged, and then maybe that honest engagement is paid forward to the next polytheist that they bump into. And then that person is then treated with respect. Ultimately, that's what I want.
Yeah.
And if that continues, then great. And I'll continue to engage on that basis. And, I'm I'm feisty at moments where I feel like I'm being disrespected, but if we're engaging in a respectful conversation, I'm going to be respectful. And I think that mutual respect and understanding and charity in conversation is valuable, especially in a conversation such as spirituality, where we're dealing with so many unknowns.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I am really glad that you got to be here today as well for this episode of Truth Wanted. This was a really grand experiment in how to do something like this. And I've learned a lot of interesting things about polytheism in general that I didn't know from this conversation, that I know that I'm going to be Googling some stuff later. If somebody wanted to know more about polytheism in general and wanted to figure out where they can find you and stuff, where should they go?
If you want to find me, there's Ocean Keltoy on Twitter, at Ocean Keltoy, and my screen name is Ocean the Wizard. As far as finding information on heathenry, I would suggest the Practical Heathen's Guide to Asatru. I have some disagreements with it in that I don't necessarily like the guided rituals that are in it, but as far as discussing what the beliefs are, what the approach is, it's a really good starter book. There's also another book by, I believe, Daniel McCoy, called The Viking Spirit. That's a very good book too, as far as like intro information. If you're interested in the philosophical angle, there is a book called A World Full of Gods by John Michael Greer, in which he breaks down a philosophical approach to polytheism and brings in a lot of like historical context, addresses arguments for atheism, addresses arguments for Christianity from a polytheistic perspective, and it's a very interesting book.
Great. Cool. Well, thanks again, Ocean, for being on with us today. It was a real pleasure having you on. I hope that you can come back to some other ACA programs sometime, whether it's mine or some of the other ones. And I really enjoyed this. I think this was really enlightening. And I'm proud to be a part of something that hasn't really been done too much before, at least here on this station. So without further ado, I think that's going to go ahead and wrap things up for tonight. I am Objectively Dan. You can find me again on Twitter at ObjectivelyDan. And also, we have a few other announcements that I need to be talking to you about. So, first thing is, the show is officially premiering October 14th, right after Atheist Experience. It's going to be really, really awesome. My buddy, Genetically Modified Skeptic, is driving all the way down from Dallas to come and do this thing with us. So he's going to be my first co-host for the official premiere of Truth Wanted. So look forward to that. We also have our Facebook group and our Patreon page and stuff already set up, ready to go. So be sure to look at those as well. I'm really, really excited for this, especially after today, after kind of experimenting with that, to see where the show goes from here. I'm really excited that you guys get to be along with me on this journey, and I'd love to hear your feedback. Definitely, like I said, find me on Twitter and also on Discord. I usually show up on the ACA Discord every once in a while. Message me, tell me what you like, what you didn't like, and all that good stuff. So I think that about wraps it up. Thanks again. Ocean, do you have any final words before we kind of close out?
No, I enjoyed the experience. I'm happy to come on again. And as far as your show, I wish you luck, man. Sounds like you've got a good thing going.
Thanks, man. Really appreciate it. All right.
Yeah.
Remember, guys, the truth is out there. Maybe sometimes we don't know, but we'll find out. Thanks. See ya.